Hello, and welcome to Part 1 in our economics series entitled For Richer, for Poorer. I'm Bruce McCarthy, and during the next few hours we'll be examining the interrelated and often confusing subjects of economics, banking, and taxation. This particular series of lessons will be focusing on money, and in particular its present-day substitute, credit. If you've grown weary of the smog and double talk of our financial experts, then why not lay aside the hocus-pocus of leading economic indicators and various pontifications and join me for an in-depth study of this particular subject of money and credit. This particular series has been designed to assist the viewer in not only knowing this particular subject, but hopefully understanding it as well. All you're going to need is a basic willingness to forget everything you've ever learned about the subject, which is far easier said than done, and begin building upon common sense. In fact, it was Voltaire who said that common sense isn't too common, and I suspect he was certainly correct. In Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 24, I'm reading from the King James Version. In Proverbs 17 and verse 24, the Word of God tells us that wisdom is before him that hath understanding, but the eyes of a fool are in the ends of the earth. We run into this kind of people, even in theology, those people who want to spend most of their time in the Revelation letter to find out how everything is going to turn out in the end. Yet if they had spent a little bit more time perhaps in Genesis to Malachi, they might understand why this world is going to end the way God is going to end it. But then, of course, that would yield understanding, and most people are only interested in the bottom line. Now, if you're only interested in the bottom line, the solution, you probably aren't going to be too interested in our in-depth study of the problem. My persuasion and belief is that the solution to any problem is embodied in an understanding of the problem itself. The better you understand the problem, the simpler the solution is going to be. Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 6 confirms what we just read in Proverbs 17:24, wherein we read, "A scorner seeketh wisdom, and findeth it not. But knowledge is easy unto him that understandeth." You see, if the more you understand, or if you do understand, then knowledge comes fairly easy. Now, many people seem to try to spend their time in rote memorization of a particular subject. I'm not here to teach you just facts and figures, but hopefully to lay some building blocks and a foundation of these particular subjects, economics, banking, and taxation, all of which are interrelated. You can't discuss finance, you can't discuss banking, and you cannot discuss taxation without understanding what you're going to use as a means of payment. Therefore, an understanding of the subject of money and its modern-day correlative, credit, is imperative. You're going to understand the sum or the whole by comprehending its individual parts. Verse 8 of chapter 14 in Proverbs, "The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit." In verse 33, "Wisdom resteth in the heart of him that hath understanding." We certainly hope and pray that as we go through this series that you will gain an understanding of these convoluted subjects, economics and banking and taxation. And I think you'll find that after you finish this particular series and perhaps reviewed it one or two times, maybe 3 or 4 times, you will understand these subjects far better and far more completely than your local banker, the economists, the experts on television, even the financial advisors. Now, this particular lesson and the entire series is not designed to give you financial advice. I'm not here to pontificate on future events, although we can certainly throw out our comments. Any of us can surmise, and some of us can do a better job of it than others, perhaps. But we're simply here to instruct you on some basic fundamentals of economics, to give you a foundation, and then you'll be able to probably outguess the experts yourself. Or at least you'll have as good a chance of predicting the future as anyone. King Solomon said that no man knows the future, and therefore how can he know when something is going to happen? So if you're going to try to make God and King Solomon a liar, certainly don't get me to help you do it. I'm not going to conspire in that particular department. It's important to understand in the subject of economics that there are some more fundamental areas of concern before you even get into the economics. Number one, it is imperative that you understand the religious background of a particular community and its political system, because it is the religion of a community or a society which will establish the political system. The political system, in turn, will then establish the economic system. You see, politics is nothing more than the administration, if you will, of the spiritual tenets of a given society. If a society happens to be Christian in its view and its outlook, then its political system will administer godly law. If, however, the political system turns out to be not so godly, it's probably because the religious tenets or the spiritual tenets of that people is anti-Christian or unscriptural in its outlook. So there is a definite relationship between the religion, the political system, and the economic system. You cannot separate them. Now, there are many people who say that there's no connection, that they believe in a separation of church and state. Well, good for you, but I'm not so sure that God believes in that. Psalm 127:1 says that unless the Lord build a house, they labor in vain them that build it. Now, is God only speaking about the construction of houses? I think not. Everything that you set your hand to do, said King Solomon, do with all your might, and you do it unto the Lord God. The rise and proliferation of humanism, which is a religion, it's been officially determined and decreed to be a religion by the various state Supreme Courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. The rise and proliferation of humanism in America and its political counterpart, which is socialism. In fact, when socialism embraces the entire globe, then a state of communism is said to exist, because communism is nothing more than universal socialism. So that has already been achieved in the world. And debt servitude, or debt bondage, as a result of the credit system. All of this is as the result of a retreating church. The church has retreated from the law of its God, preaching that we are under grace only and that we're not under law. This is absolute poppycock, balderdash, and I could use a few other words, especially before I got saved, or whatever you might want to call it. Law of God imparts responsibility. Grace imparts none. Yet the church world teaches that we're not under law, but that we're under grace. Well, without law, you could have no grace, and without law, you could have no sin. 1 John 3:4 defines sin as being transgression of the law. And that's the law of God, not the law of man. When the preachers call a person down forward to repent, O sinner, what they're telling the person is that he has transgressed God's law, even though they may preach to that individual that he's not under God's law. So without the law of God, there could be no sin, and with no sin, there could be no sinner. With no sinner, there could be no altar call, and with no altar call and no sin and no law, there could be no grace, because grace is the forgiveness of the transgression of the law, or the forgiveness of the sin. So what I'm saying here is that law and grace do not stand diametrically opposed to one another. They're in perfect harmony with one another, and you can't have one without the other. The religious, political, and economic world or community out there is divided into two basic spheres: a Christian, biblical sphere, and an unchristian or anti-Christian, unbiblical sphere. The religious community of the world is divided into two basic groups: theocratic versus democratic. These words come from the Greek Theocratic, for example, means theos, God, kratein, to make rule. In a theocracy, for example, God makes the rules. In a democracy, man makes the rules. Demos, man, kratein, to make the rules. Now, the religious community is divided into two basic groups, the theocratic versus the democratic. Most of the church world, for example, believes that man makes the rules. Man makes the law. Even most of the Christian churches are teaching that we're not under the laws of God, and therefore we must be subject to the laws of man. Any society that will not readily accept the absolutes of God must be prepared to endure the vicissitudes and the variables of man. Our political sphere is also divided into two particular blocks or segments. And I'll simply call one the East Bloc and the other the West Bloc. Most everyone's familiar with those terms. And most everyone believes, although I believe in error, that the world is divided into an East and West Bloc. My contention is there's not a great deal of difference between East and West. The Russians probably speak Russian or several other dialects. We speak English, and it looks like we're going to learn Spanish here right quickly. And no telling what else. The Chinese speak Chinese. But there really isn't a great deal of difference between the law they administer and the law we administer. And we'll get into some of those points of commonality in a few minutes. But the political sphere divided into two blocks, East and West. The theocratic used to be the West, where God made our rules and our law. In fact, when the Founding Fathers came to this land, they brought with them the book. They believed that they had the law contained between the covers of this book, and they administered the law of this book, as the laws of Massachusetts and Connecticut will very amply demonstrate. That a person, for example, was put to death for certain capital and infamous crimes, and the crimes were defined by the Bible, not by the men who were trying to administer the laws of the Bible in Massachusetts and Connecticut back in colonial times. The economic sphere, or world outside, is also divided into two particular blocks, or two particular categories. You can have either a monetary system or a credit system. A monetary system uses something as money. It uses a tangible, a form of wealth in hand-to-hand circulation. It's an equal exchange, an asset for an asset. The Latin phrase would be quid pro quo. Alternatively, you can use a credit system. And a credit system doesn't use anything as a medium of exchange. It uses nothing as money. And that's what we have in America. That's what they have in the Soviet Union. In fact, the entire globe operates in 1986, and for many years, has operated only on a credit system, not on a monetary system. So if you're worried about a monetary failure, fret not. That came a long time ago. The next concern is a credit collapse. The purpose of our lessons is going to be to demonstrate a connection between the religious, the political, and the economic, and hopefully to clarify the shift between the former Christian constitutional republic that our forefathers had established and the not-so-free anti-Christian humanist socialist state that we now have, which most people still consider to be a free country. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, in its little pamphlet entitled The Price System, tells us that the changes that have taken place in America were rather subtle and that they were gradual. Therefore, they weren't very noticeable. Page 1, quote, "Although the changes have been gradual and may not be too noticeable, the economic system we call free enterprise is different than it was just a few decades ago. For one thing, it isn't quite so free as it used to be." Have you noticed? Now, for a resolution of the problems that we have taking place around us, and I suspect that many of you are aware of them, the foreclosures, the bankruptcies, inflation, price escalations, whatever you might want to call them, a growing dependence upon government, in particular the federal government. In order to resolve this particular problem, if you perceive it as a problem as I do, is going to require an understanding of the responsibilities that are imposed upon us by law. And that law, of course, is the law of the Scriptures. You see, law imparts responsibility, grace imparts none. The insidious aspect of slavery and the tyrannical system that administers the slavery that we have in America today is that it was all voluntarily sought. For example, concerning education, most parents seek to abrogate the responsibility to teach their children, as we're told in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and Deuteronomy chapter 11, and instead of the parents teaching their own children, they delegate that responsibility to someone else. That someone else in America and all over the world has turned out to be the public school system, which, according to the Communist Manifesto, is the 10th plank. Out of 10, there are 10 basic provisions in this Communist Manifesto, sort of like the 10 Commandments, if you will, of communism. But number 10 simply reads, free education for all children in public schools. And there's a little bit more involved as well. But we have a public school system, which took over the responsibility of the parent. In fact, when I was in my teenage years, my parents sent me off to a private school. Not only did they have the tax burden to send me to a public school, but they also picked up an additional burden to send me to private school. And this particular school that I attended back in my home state of Maine had a sign out front with a picture of a lamp, maybe like a genie's Aladdin lamp or something. And there was a statement in Latin. It said, in loco parentis. In loco parentis, according to Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, if I can find it real quick, means instead of the parent. In loco parentis, page 708. In the place of a parent, instead of a parent, charged factiously with the parent's rights, duties, and responsibilities. Well, so much for one responsibility that we delegated to someone else. When it came to our working conditions, when we finally got old enough to go out into the salt mines, we decided that it was really too difficult to approach the boss man and say, we'd like to have better working conditions, or we'd like to receive more pay, or I've been working a little harder and haven't you noticed? We decided it would be a lot easier if we hired someone else to represent us, to represent our grievance. So we joined a trade union. And of course, trade unions are part of the Communist International, which allows us to pit labor against management and so forth. In fact, we even have unions of management, I suspect. This was a delegation of our responsibility to a third party, once again. And then we find pretty soon that these union bosses, who are making many hundreds of thousands of dollars of some kind of credit or money or something, start hobnobbing with political figures, and they no longer represent the lower echelon union members. But then you've got to expect that when you have someone else trying to do your work for you. He really has no vested interest in representing you after a fashion, and he will chase after the best deal. In areas of health and home protection and other areas of protection, we delegated our responsibility to the insurance companies. And we hired them for a fee to be responsible for our actions on the highways. In fact, one good way to get people to drive more carefully would be to take away their insurance. I don't think we'd even need speed limit signs on the highways once we did that. And people would probably start using their blinker, and they'd probably make sure that their signals worked and their brake lights worked and so forth, if they didn't have insurance. But insurance was a means of limiting our liability, and liability in law means responsibility. It was our responsibility as Christians, I certainly hope you are one, to know law. Because after all, God is our lawgiver, Isaiah 33:22, And James confirmed that at 4:12 when he said, "For there is but one lawgiver." And since Jesus Christ is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he must have a kingdom that he's going to set up if he's not already setting it up or has already set up. And he's going to have people that he's a king over, so he's going to have subjects. And that's us. And the subjects are going to be bound by his law. But we didn't want to know his law. It was a lot easier to get in trouble and hire an attorney later on. So the responsibility to know law was delegated to the attorneys, and if you've ever talked with an attorney, you'll find out that most of the attorneys don't know law. Now, they may know some courtroom procedure, but courtroom procedure is not law. Sir William Blackstone, the eminent English jurist, had said something to the effect that an enactment which does not first conform to the laws of God is not a law. And we have an awful lot of enactments which are coming out of Washington, D.C., out of your state capitals, and even out of your municipalities. They are not law. They may look like it, but they're not law. We had another area of responsibility, and that was the responsibility to take care of our own households in terms of maybe our books and records, especially when you get into a credit system such as we live in today. There are a lot of books and a lot of records. But lo and behold, we don't even want that responsibility, so we hire the certified public accountant. And for some reason or other, we have found, or we believe, or he has told us, that he can add and subtract and come up with a better figure than we can. Don't know how he does it. And then we delegated our responsibility to take care of our own monetary resources to the bank. And for those of you who are aware and astute in this particular area, you remember that the bank walked off with the money and left us with receipts for the money. Well, so much for hiring someone else to take care of our own business. If you want something done right, you do it yourself. And that's something we've been trying to avoid most of our lives. Government regulation, which is nothing more than the administration of the commercial laws that we've just gotten involved with here. You know, when you join a trade union, or if you get insurance, if you hire an attorney or a CPA, or if you have funds with a bank and you're using negotiable instruments, then you're subject to different bodies of law by contract, because a contract is a bond of law. And all of these areas, and many, many others, are areas in which we have become bound to a different system of jurisprudence. You may call it equity, admiralty, maritime, international law, law merchant, commercial law. All of those are basically law of contract. What's rather insidious about all of that is that we do it by application. In other words, it's our own fault. Here's a publication here put up by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia again. It's called Big Government. And on the first page they tell us, quote, "A politician is addressing the home folks. For the first 15 minutes he extols states' rights, and the crowd cheers. For the second 15 minutes he tells how he is going to fight for an increase in federal subsidies, and the crowd cheers just as enthusiastically. The speaker and his constituents are good examples of the split vision with which Americans view government. In principle, many of us are against the extension of federal influence and control, but in practice we turn right around and apply for each and every governmental benefit that happens to be available." End quote. See, Jesus said that it was by their fruits you shall know them, not by their much speaking. So you can tell the world that you're against government influence in your life. But if you apply for a government grant of privilege, or if you apply for some sort of emolument or financial handout, then your deeds will speak far louder than your words. You see, when you get involved in making an application for, let's say, a bank loan, mortgage, government food stamps, a license of some sort, perhaps a license to get married, or a license to pursue an occupation, or a license to go from point A to point B, like a driver's license, you're entering a privileged status. You'll notice, for example, that motor vehicle divisions will tell you that driving is a privilege. Well, driving may be a privilege, traveling is not. But certainly, if you have the license, you have applied for a privilege. because a license is a grant of privilege. It's a grant of permission to do something which would otherwise be against the law. And there's nothing against the law about traveling from one place to another, nor in getting married. But now if you want permission to do that from the state and then become subject to a different set of rules other than the Bible rules, then you're applying for privilege status. And the word privilege, according to Webster's 1828 dictionary, comes from two root words which translate from privius lex to private law. Privilege is privius, private, lex, or law, private law. And when you apply for a privilege, you're applying to get into private law, and you're seeking to exempt yourself from that law which was common to us all. Thou shalt not kill, or murder, or whatever. So you can kill in self-defense. So make sure you understand that in its proper context. But thou shalt not kill is a law. It's common law. And you don't need to get out your ballpoint pen and fill out an application form after you've read the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and say, yes, God, those are pretty good laws. I think I will subscribe to those and I will apply to be bound by them, and here's my application. You don't need to do that. But if you want to become bound by another set of laws, distinctly separate oftentimes from biblical law, then you need to sign your name and apply to be bound by that system of jurisprudence. And you've probably noticed in the course of your lives how many times people have wanted your signature. We give away our signature like it was a drink of water. Your signature is your common law property and cannot be taken from you without your consent. Anyway, the application is indicative of the fact that we've done this to ourselves. You see the word application when in big government the Federal Reserve says that we turn right around and apply for each and every governmental benefit. The word apply or application, according to Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition, is synonymous with beg, entreat, or beseech. So when we apply for something, in the eyes of the court, we would be in a kneel begging position. Well, who would be sovereign in this particular case? The person who's doing the begging or the party that is granting the bequeath? Well, certainly the granting party is the sovereign in the contract. So if you're applying for bank credit, the bank is sovereign. The bank is the granting party. You're the beggar and they're the grantor. You're the grantee. In the words of Pogo, the cartoon comic strip, we have met the enemy and it is us. We apply. Debt, you see, is a privilege. You don't have a right to go in debt. No right whatsoever. It's a privilege. It's private law. And we get into debt by application. For example, I have an application form here. It's for Visa and MasterCard application. This was put out by the Rocky Mountain Bank Card System of Denver, Colorado. And the form is rather extensive. They want the name of the applicant. Well, the applicant is the person who's doing the begging. They want to know the beggar's name, social security number, if he has one, address, where he works, how many dependents, what his monthly payments are, how much he earns. All of this information, of course, is none of their business unless you volunteer to give it to them. And this is all voluntarily completed. In fact, underneath the signature block, in small print, it says, I, /we, certify that the above is true and complete. I, /we, have read and agreed to all the terms and conditions set forth in the application agreement. Now, an agreement's a contract. A contract is an agreement to do or not to do a certain thing. So this is a contract. And a contract brings about the force of law or creates a bond of law. You sign a contract and you're now bound by the terms of the contract as though it were law. They go on. I, /we, authorize you to gather whatever credit information you consider necessary and appropriate. Well, I thought all the information they wanted here was all that was necessary and appropriate. No. By your signature, you're now granting them carte blanche, permission to go after any other information about you they can find, and they're the ones who decide how much information they want. They're the sovereign in the contract. We also authorize you to give such information to others who have a legitimate reason for the information. I wonder who that could be. And don't think that it stops with internal revenue. It continues on to almost every branch of government, state, county, local, federal, and foreign. That's all available because of the tax treaties that government agencies have with one another, and the fact that the banking corporation, which grants you this extension of credit, the banking corporation is a creature of the state. It's a corporation. Corporations are artificial persons created by the state. Therefore, the state has the power and the prerogative to investigate the affairs of its own creation. That's only reasonable. And one of the requirements is that when the state investigates the banks, they want to know what the bank is doing, and the bank is going to have to release information about you. Credit, which is the right to defer payment, creates a correlative called debt. If you apply for credit, which is the right to defer the payment, then you have just gone in debt. Debt being a sum of money due, by definition. Black's Law Dictionary will refer to State versus Doucet and other cases defining the term debt. So you can't have credit without debt, and you can't have debt without credit. They go hand in hand. Credit equals debt equals bondage. Because the contract that we involve ourselves with, in this particular case with the bank, puts us under servitude to the bank. Proverbs 22:7 tells us that the rich ruleth over the poor, and the borrower is the servant to the lender. If the borrower is the servant to the lender, then the borrower is in servitude to the lender, and we have now entered contract bondage. Bondage by agreement. This is not involuntary servitude, rather. This is voluntary servitude. And you'll remember probably when you studied the United States Constitution how it prohibited specifically involuntary servitude. I'll be reading from the United States Constitution as found in the back of Black's Law Dictionary, 5th edition, Amendment number 13, which was ratified in 1865. This is found on page 1500 of Black's Law Dictionary, Section 1. Quote, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. It said neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. Well, what is slavery? Voluntary or involuntary? It's involuntary. What's involuntary servitude? Is that slavery or is it not slavery? It's slavery. So what they're saying here is that neither slavery nor slavery shall exist, or that neither involuntary servitude nor involuntary servitude shall exist. But they didn't say that we couldn't have voluntary servitude. And that's what we did. We made application to become a slave. We've all done it. That's why it's so difficult to oppose communism when the average individual who appears to be fighting it has actually applied to become bound by many of the elements of the tyranny that he calls communism. This is why it's so difficult to lay the blame to someone else, like say IRS is at fault, or the CFR, the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Bilderbergers, or the Masonic Lodge, or the Jews are the problem. We can lay all the curses we want to on other peoples and organizations, make them our scapegoats. But the truth of the matter is even if they help induce us into the bondage, we are the ones that actually took the bait. We can blame the pushers of the drugs all we want to, but if there were no customers, the pushers would have nothing to push. Well, certainly they'd have no one to push it upon. In order to induce a little bit of confusion in the subject of economics, which is basically the science of deception and plunder, it was necessary to twist and distort some of the meanings of terms. Verbal trickery has been employed generously in the subject of economics, which is why most people find economics a dismal subject. I can't understand it. I took it in college. I couldn't understand what the professor was saying. But I cheated my way through. I passed the test. I gave him the answers he wanted. And I got my degree in whatever it might have been, agricultural economics or whatever. Did you understand the subject? No. Did you like the subject? No. Well, maybe it's because there's a lot of subterfuge and you just couldn't quite handle it. In 1961, the Committee on the Judiciary of the United States Senate had a little pamphlet published entitled Wordsmanship. They gave it a subtitle, Semantics as a Communist Weapon. I'll read just an excerpt from that, page 1, Wordsmanship. Quote, "This natural confusion of language invites artificial manipulation. A medieval French king said, 'He who can't dissimulate can't rule.' And the word dissimulate means to conceal by pretense. In other words, if you can't look at your constituents, smile at them while you're robbing them blind, you'll never make it in the king business. Of course, we're fortunate in America that our politicians would never do that to us, would they? Hence, the article goes on, language is not only a tool to communicate, it also can be used or abused as a weapon to mislead, to create wrong impressions, and to induce false thinking. The weapon of words is more subtle and less immediately destructive than nuclear bombs. But just like the winds and the seas which can hollow out the hardest rock, it has the power of eroding society." End quote. United States Senate. Verbal trickery has been used not only in economics, it's been used in the religious community, it's been used in the subject of taxation. Lawyers employ it often. For example, the word willful. Most people think the word willful means that it was done voluntarily, of your own free will. What does it mean to a lawyer? If, for example, Internal Revenue were to proceed against an individual for willful failure to file, willful failure to pay, or willful failure to report, pursuant to the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, Section 7203, what does the word willful mean there? Does it simply mean that you did it of your own free will? Well, let's see what Black's Law Dictionary says it means. The word willful on page 1434 means an act or omission is willfully done if done voluntarily and intentionally and with the specific intent to do something the law forbids, or with the specific intent to fail to do something the law requires. That is to say, with bad purpose, either to disobey or to disregard the law. But when used in a criminal context, it generally means an act done with a bad purpose, without justifiable excuse, stubbornly, obstinate, perversely, a thing done without ground for believing it is lawful, or conduct marked by a careless disregard whether or not one has the right so to act. Premeditated, malicious, done with evil intent, or with a bad motive or purpose, or with indifference to the natural consequences, unlawful, without legal justification. End quote. You see, in order to have a crime committed, you have to have the act, plus you have to have intent. The intent is not simply, did you plan to do it? Did you intend to do it? Did you will yourself to do it? That's not intent. Intent is a willful doing of something that you know to be against the law. So, the average individual on the street uses the word willful in a very casual fashion. But be on guard if you're ever in a courtroom and someone asks you if you did something willfully. They're using the word with a little different connotation. The word income might be another particular example. Many of you are familiar with. Most people, of course, on the street believe that income is whatever comes in. And that's correct for a street definition of the term. However, income is gains or profit. It's the whatever comes in, the gross income, versus the outgo, leaving whatever you have as a net, which is your profit over and above your expenses. That is the income for which the income tax is apparently levied. But the average individual doesn't bother to look up the word income because we all assume that we know what the word means. And assumptions have gotten us into trouble more than once. Motor vehicle is another particular term. I was looking through some paperwork recently and I found that the California statutes, apparently from someone's research, define motor vehicle as a contrivance or a conveyance used on the highways for commercial purposes. Do you have a motor vehicle? I don't. I might have an automobile, I might have a motorhome, but I don't have a motor vehicle. And if I don't have a motor vehicle, I might not be subject necessarily to motor vehicle statutes. Reasonable? There are other examples. For example, the word title. Most people believe, for example, when they go down to get an automobile or a new travel trailer or a motorhome or whatever it might be, that they merely get a bill of sale and they get possession of the object, but that they don't yet get title. In fact, some advertisements will tell you that the price of this new such-and-such pickup truck is such-and-such a figure, and then they'll have in small print, does not include title, excise, registration. Well, it may not include the fees for some of those things, such as registration fees, but do you not receive title when you get the object in question if you pay for it? Actually, title passes from the seller to the buyer as soon as you pay for the object in question. And if it was your money that you used, hopefully something like gold or silver that you used to purchase an object, an asset for an asset transaction, so you actually bought it at law instead of discharged the obligation in equity, then title has passed to you. Well, what does title look like? I've never seen one. Title is a non-tangible appellation called ownership, and I've never seen an ownership. Have you? You cannot see, smell, hear, taste, or touch an ownership. But you can see, smell, hear, taste, or touch a document that evidences ownership, and that could be a document of title. Those are required also when you get the new automobile, but not necessarily from a state office. We'll cover that later on. In order to control a population, and that's what our credit system is used to do, to control the people. Because if we're going to have slaves, we're going to have masters. And if the borrower is servant to the lender, then there must be someone out there who is controlling his slaves. In order to control them, you need to control the meaning of words. If you can control the words a person uses, you can control their thinking. And if you can control their thinking, you can control their actions. And if you can control their actions, you control them. Now, much confusion abounds in the subject of economics. I'll just give you a little bit of a demonstration on some of that. In a publication put out by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, it's called The Federal Reserve System, Purposes and Functions. This comes out of Washington, D.C., which is Malfunction Junction. On page 10, they tell us here, quote, "For one thing, it is not clear how best to define money." Wow. This is the governing authority of the Central Bank of the United States, and they can't even define money. They go on, quote, "Economists have not been able to agree on the best definition of money." Gee, those are experts, and they can't even agree on the definition. The Federal Reserve publishes 3 definitions, they say here, and it takes all of them into account in evaluating policy. The 3 measures are A, money narrowly defined, B, money more broadly defined, and C, a broader definition. And I did a little bit of expunging of some text there, but I don't think we changed the meaning, as you'll see when we do an overlay on this. They switched from 3 definitions to 3 measures. They said the Federal Reserve publishes 3 definitions. Then in the next sentence begin to tell us that they have 3 measures. Well, folks, you can measure gasoline, honey, water, and milk. You can measure those all in quarts and ounces, gallons, and liters. But liters, gallons, and quarts do not define the substances being measured. You can define something or you can measure it. But measuring something is not defining it. So right off the bat, in one sentence, they leave the reader behind, and I don't think it's any wonder that we can't understand the subject of economics if we're not going to define the terms. We could go to college, and if you had and taken economics, you may have at one time taken economics and read this particular book called Readings in Money, National Income, and Stabilization Policy. The word policy is used frequently in economics, business, and finance, and especially government activities. The word policy comes to us from another language and another word. The word was policy, from which we derive our word police. And the word policy and police convey and imply control and management. The word policy is used in this book no less than 2,177 times, and I would suspect that it's one of those innocuous words that we just tend to overlook without defining precisely. To give you an idea of some of the confusion that we have in economics, we have an article here written by James Tobin. In fact, this whole book is a compendium of articles written by economists, monetary experts. The article is entitled Commercial Banks as Creators of Money. Who was James Tobin? Well, at the time he wrote this article in 1963, he was the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University. Page 157, he says, quote, "For example, an eminent monetary economist, more candid than many of his colleagues, admits that we don't really know what money is, but proceeds to argue that whatever it is, its supply should grow regularly at a rate of the order of 3 to 4% per year," end quote. "Excuse me, what do you do, sir?" "Oh, I'm an economist." "Great, I've been looking for somebody to tell me what money is. Can you please define it for me?" "No, I don't know what it is. I couldn't define it, but whatever it is, its supply should grow regularly at the rate of 3 or 4% per year." Marvelous. Rightly did Jesus say that when the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the ditch. And if you took economics when you were in college and it didn't make any sense, it may be that you just didn't enjoy falling into the ditch. I have an article here that's written by Gardner Ackley. It's entitled The Multiplier Time Period, Money, Inventories, and Flexibility. Wow, how's that for a convoluted title? This guy must really be an expert. Who is he? Gardner Ackley is a professor of economics, University of Michigan, and chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Now, this was written back in 1951. Well, let's see what we can learn from this individual. Page 93, Gardner Ackley. He says here, quote, "Again, there may be ambiguity in precise definition, though this is unimportant," end quote. Did you know that there was ambiguity in precise definition? Well, if there is, that's not important. Page 94. "In general, however, and generalities here become not too useful," end quote. What's he saying? He says, I'm going to waste a little bit of your time. We're going to be talking about generalities, but generalities aren't too useful. Why waste time talking about them? Page 96. "My opinion is that we do not know enough about opinion formation to be able even to suggest realistic considerations with respect to this case." What does that mean? It's going to waste some more of your time. Page 96 again. "Although we can dismiss this case theoretically as outside our domain, practically speaking, the importance of this case cannot be lightly dismissed." Or, page 117, an article written by two economists. These were Paul A. Samuelson and Robert M. Solow. The 1980 Jewish Almanac, for example, tells us that Paul Samuelson had received a Nobel Prize in economics back a few years ago. And at the time this article was written, they were both professors of economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Listen to this wisdom, page 117. If there is anything in this line of thought, it may be that one of the important causes of inflation is inflation. Well, page 118. We leave it as an open question. You'll see why in a moment. It may be that creeping inflation leads only to creeping inflation. Did you know that the cause created its own effect, and that the effect was caused by the cause and caused by itself? Do you know what causes obesity? Fat. Do you know what causes thinness? Skinny. If you want to get fat, eat fat. Or get fat, or be fat. Verbal trickery has been used in this subject of economics. I'll go back to this book on policy, Readings in Money, National Income as Stabilization Policy, page 237. This was an article that was written by Warren L. Smith and appeared in the National Banking Review, September 1963. He says here, quote, on page 237, there may be circumstances under which the Federal Reserve, that's our central bank, should try to affect economic activity by influencing the public's expectations. Now this is getting in and tampering with your think tank, when they're tampering with your expectations. This is psychological manipulation, and it's spoken of in other Federal Reserve publications as well. Although this is clearly a tricky and possibly even dangerous form of activity. To the extent that it is employed, it should be divorced from actions designed to control bank reserves and should take advantage of the subtleties of everyday language. End quote. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly like to have someone take advantage of the subtleties of everyday language to control my expectations. But that's precisely what's done by our central bank. The Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond puts out a brochure, a publication. It's called The Federal Reserve at Work. And in this particular publication, they tell us how they manipulate an economy and affect the behavior of all segments of that economy. For example, on page 8, quote, monetary policy affects domestic expenditures by influencing the behavior of three different groups: lenders, borrowers, and non-borrowing spenders. Does that include you? They go on. Page 8 also. Quote, tight and easy money can also influence the attitudes of spenders who neither borrow nor lend. So you see, we're influencing the behavior and attitudes, and we just found out earlier, the expectations of the public. On page 11 of this publication, the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond tells us, quote, in selecting various combinations of policy, remember the word policy is to control or manipulate or manage. In selecting various combinations of policy actions, the Federal Reserve considers both psychological and direct effects of its decisions. If it is felt that a psychological effect is needed to reinforce the direct effects, policy measures may well include changes in reserve requirements or the discount rate, etc., etc. Psychological manipulation, they operate on the general public. But how many people in the general public are aware that it's being done? And if they knew that it was being done, how many would consent to its continued application? The confusion in the subject of money is further demonstrated by our poster here, an article that was written by Louis Rukeyser. Louis Rukeyser is a name that many of you people may be familiar with. He has appeared on some of the Wall Street programs on educational TV, and you may have watched him on your electronic campfire. That's a television set. This appeared in the business section, Section C of the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, Tuesday, June 1, 1982. The article was entitled, "Just What is Money? Does Anyone Know?" What a question. It's Dateline, New York, and Rockefeller is telling us, quote, "Some of the nation's leading experts on money have begun very quietly to make what many would regard as an astonishing admission. They don't know what they're talking about." I'd be kind of quiet too if I were an expert and I didn't know what I was talking about, wouldn't you? In this case, as it happens, they mean it literally. They don't know what money is in 1982. Now, these are the experts. This isn't the average Joe Blow on the street. We're pretty certain that the person on the street doesn't know what money is, but these are the experts. The article goes on, and I'll have to read it from another source here because it wouldn't all fit on the poster. Take George W. McKinney, Jr., a highly respected economist who is retiring next month from New York's Irving Trust Company. Now, this is no small bank, and this is not what we'd call a spring chicken when it comes to economics. He would have retired in July of 1982. Rockefeller puts to him this question, quote, "Is it then that we just don't know what money is these days?" Here's the answer from the expert. Quote, "Never did know." "Never did know," confessed McKinney, and then while listeners to our conversation chuckled nervously, made clear he wasn't kidding. You know, when the experts can't even define a simple word like money, I think it's time to examine the subject on our own and see if we can begin to make sense of it. Can you imagine writing to Standard Oil Company and ask them for the definition of gasoline and have them write back and say, "We don't know and we never did"? Or perhaps writing a letter to McDonald's Corporation and ask them for the definition of hamburger and have them write back and say, "We don't know and we never did"? Of course, come to think of it, I guess I can believe that. In our next segment, in Part 2, we'll be going into definition of some basic terminology. We'll be defining the word economics, its origin. We'll be going into the various systems of economics, that of money and credit. We'll be defining money and credit. We'll give a little bit of a history as to what has been used as money. We will then show the amount of information that passes hands. For example, when you deal in a credit system as opposed to a monetary system. We'll get into just weights and measures. We'll look at the scriptures, and we'll see what the Bible has to say about the subject of money and just weights and measures and many other things. So won't you join us? Now let's take a break. Welcome back to Part 2 of our continuing series on economics. Since economists and the Federal Reserve